walked in with a misstep. She's got a black tie.
Who is it?
It's me, 6.
Come in?
It's me. Don't you remember? Yeah, of course you do. We had some good times, but it's been a while. It's been a while since I saw you.
Yeah, hi.
What have you been up? Oh, I guess I see what you've been up to. I mean, look at you. You've rearranged.
Yeah, it's a lot's changed in here.
Looks nice, and I see you've gotten a few new things.
Yeah, it's been nice.
Good for you. I hope it makes you happy. Yeah.
Yeah, so what do you want?
What do I want? After all this time, that's all you get? How about some appreciation? How about some respect? I mean, don't you miss me?
Not really.
What?
Look, it's no hard feelings, but I've moved on.
Oh, I guess you have. And why wouldn't you? I mean, just look at you. Next to that fancy gear with all those knobs. Yeah, I bet you feel good when you're twiddling those knobs. I bet you tell yourself it makes a difference. But you're doing real work, I mean.
What's your point?
Oh, I think you know. I think you know the truth.
Yeah, what's that?
You know why you twiddle those knobs. It's because you recorded the wrong sound. Or maybe you wrote the wrong part, or maybe you played it like shit. Or maybe you don't even know your own song, and you need those knobs to write it for you. And you know what? I take it back. I was wrong. I don't know you. The guy I know, he had real skills. Skills he learned when he was recording with me and with nothing else. But I don't see him here. I just see another softy shopping and experimenting and twiddling his knobs instead of doing the real work, the work of recording. I mean, how much did that thing cost?
About 700.
700? You could buy an entire rig for that. Look, man, I've seen enough. I'm done with you.
Wait. No. We're not done here. The DP-006 is Tascam's smallest and lightest and cheapest multi-tracker. It also has the most limited feature set. To some folks, it probably seems like a gimmick or a toy, but I can assure you it's much more than that. I've spent many hours with this device, and it's a perfectly good multi-tracker, but its limitations also make it something more. From my childhood, I remember fables and fairy tales about magic mirrors, some of which only showed you the truth, no matter how harsh. The DP-006, like any other bare-bones multi-tracker, has some of that same magic. It reproduces what you put into it. No more, no less. You can't compress things, you can't EQ them, you can't add any effects, you can't do anything except adjust volume and panning. And the results can be painful. I mean, they don't have to be, but if there are any flaws in you or in the music you're making, this is going to expose them. Because the DP-006 gives you exactly what you put into it. And if you want the results to be good, you have to be good. Now, of course, you can make good sounds with other devices. I mean, all of you do, everyone does, but everybody does also tend to follow the path of least resistance in any situation, including recording. And if your device gives you options, especially powerful options for manipulating sounds, and if those options seem easier to you than another take, you're naturally going to try them first. That's precisely what you cannot do with this device. There just aren't that many paths available. So the path of least resistance is either to give up on getting a good sound, or to go back to fundamentals, to get it right at the source. Now, I don't fully believe it, but there is a voice in my head that says you can't call yourself good and act like you know what you're doing unless you can do it under these constraints. That perspective touches a nerve with me, because I have this YouTube channel where I express opinions and give some advice. I hold myself out as knowing something. And recently I've done all of my recording using Tascam's Model 12, which is the nicest, most fully featured device I've ever owned. It doesn't have all of the bells and whistles, but it has a lot of them, and I have used them, sometimes to put lipstick on a pig. I know better, and I can do better. Long ago, I didn't have a choice. And I guess I needed a reminder, like a project that would be a high school basketball coach getting in my face and screaming at me that I sucked and then waiting to be proven wrong, forcing me to go back to fundamentals and to take honest stock of the results. The DP-006 can play that role. I know that intuitively from experience, but conceptually I think there are two reasons why. The first is that it's a minimalist device. It's a teeny-weeny all-in-one recording solution with the bare essentials and nothing else. And the second reason, in a way, is because it's cheap. And it comes with features like built-in microphones that allow you to remove other pieces of gear from your process and in a way streamline your workflow. I knew that this device and those characteristics would force me to focus on recording fundamentals. But I also knew from experience that there are workarounds. And I didn't want to think about those things in this project. I wanted to be forced to focus on the bare essentials. So I went a step further. I challenged myself to make a recording in the spirit of the DP-006, meaning that at every step along the way I would prioritize minimalism and budget. Obviously, those are flexible concepts, but my goal was to use as little gear as possible, and when I had options, to choose the cheapest option available. I hoped that this project, with all of its hurdles and constraints, would reinforce my good habits and reveal, maybe even punish, all my bad habits. And I got everything I hoped. And in this video, I want to share it all with you, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Everything I experienced and learned from spending about 4 days staring into this magic mirror.
And don't worry, I'll be there to keep him honest.
First, I needed to create a skeleton of my song, and I chose to do that by building a drum pattern in an app called Oxy.
Wait, I thought you wanted to be minimalist and budget friendly. You're reaching for software?
Well, it's an app on my phone, and it is very easy to use, and it is relatively inexpensive. It's like $5 a month.
Let's add a full month to the budget.
This drum track is the first time that I took advantage of one of the best features of this particular multi-tracker, and that's the presence of these two stereo tracks. When I bought this device, I didn't think that having the stereo capability on these tracks was going to be that useful, and I was wrong. It's extremely useful, including for receiving stereo signals, but also for receiving stereo bounces. And of course, more on that later. So I tracked the drum machine part.
Tell them about the part.
What do you want to know?
You're supposed to be focused on fundamentals, like writing the part.
Okay, yeah, so it's a really simple drum part with just like a bass, some hi-hat sounds, and a snare. None of the sounds is terribly big or has a ton of reverb on it. I thought that would make it easy to fit into a mix, including a mix that might end up getting pretty dense.
But were those sounds good enough? As big as you really wanted?
Actually, no. I mean, having finished the track, I probably wish the bass and snare sounds were bigger.
And how could you have done better?
Well, I guess I could have done better on the front end. I mean, from experience, I know that I tend to prefer for those two elements to have more volume. I guess I just have to
think more, plan ahead?
Yeah, I guess so. Now that I had a rhythm or groove framework for the song, I needed to add something to provide a harmonic skeleton for the song, so I recorded a clean guitar track that I'd kind of been thinking about and practicing. It kind of had a bouncy feel that would not have been out of place in earlier versions of this song. The idea was that the part would provide some harmonic information but not take up that much space. I actually performed the part with this guitar. It is in my mind like the quintessential budget guitar, which seemed perfect for this project. It also has a variety of sonic options, as most Strat style guitars do, so I thought that I'd be able to get a lot of mileage out of it. I did one performance with that guitar and actually recorded it in two ways. The first was a direct signal straight out of the guitar and into one of the quarter-inch inputs, and the second was a mic'd signal from one of the built-in microphones.
Oh, it's been a long time since you used one of my mics. Talk more about that.
When I bought this device, one of my favorite features is that it had built-in microphones. That was the clearest sign to me that this was intended to be like an all-in-one recording solution. Over time, I decided that I preferred using external mics, but the built-in mics are perfectly good. I don't actually know what kind of mics they are, but they kind of function like budget condenser mics. They're pretty sensitive, and though they're probably cardioid in pattern, they're not terribly directional. But that didn't matter at all as I was recording the sound of an unplugged electric guitar. So at that point, I had filled 3 of my available channels, 1 with drum machine, 2 with guitar, and I decided to fill the last track with a lead vocal. I like to track lead vocal early in a project because I end up writing the arrangement during recording, and it's easier for me to build parts around and that interact, that play nicely with the lead vocal if I can actually hear the lead vocal. So I knew I wanted to do a vocal. The question is, how?
Ah, another failure to plan.
Yeah, but it's early in the session. I can experiment.
We'll see about that.
Okay, so the lyrics of this particular song are actually set late at night in sort of an intimate environment, and I had an idea of trying some really soft, almost whispered vocals in the style of Billie Eilish, maybe with some ASMR influences. So I planned to essentially whisper the vocals right up next to one of these microphones. That kind of proximity not only introduced proximity effect and made the vocal sound fuller, bassier, but it also created tons of noise. So I ended up having to add to the budget a pop filter to make my life a little easier.
And was it easy?
Well, not really. I'm actually not that good at performing those kind of whispered vocals consistently. So I had a fair number of like volume fluctuations that were frustrating.
And what would you normally do?
Well, if I had more controls or bigger knobs, I might try to adjust those in mixing, but I couldn't really do that here, so I just had to do the vocals again until I got them right.
It's 2 a.m. when I get your text.
In fact, I was really happy with the quiet vocal for a lot of the song, but there were some sections that I thought needed to be a little bit more intense. So I thought I would record a contrasting loud vocal. And in order to do that, I had to free up one of the 4 tracks. So I took the 2 tracks of guitar and bounced them down to 1. Bouncing is a step that is foreign to people who work only in DAWs, but it's really, I like to call them pre-mixes. I mean, all it is doing a final mix of a subset of the elements of your song, putting them in a position relative to each other that they're going to stay in forever. It's actually really easy to do with something like a DI and mic'd signal from a guitar, because when you blend those together, you're going to have a sense of the sound that you like, and it just becomes the sound of that guitar. But as you might expect, bouncing becomes more complex and more difficult as you introduce more sounds into the bounce. With the track available, I moved on to recording my loud vocal. And since the goal was to create contrast with the original vocal, I did everything differently. I pulled back from the DP-006 mic as far as I could.
Oh, so you mean on the other side of the room?
No, actually, and that's a good point. I was using these Apple earbuds to monitor the sound, and I actually used them for all of the bouncing, mixing, for everything that I did on this project.
Those probably sound like shit.
It's like, maybe, but they're available and portable and cheap, so I made them work. Anyway, I stood a distance from the microphone and I sang loud, almost a shout. And that ended up inspiring a really powerful performance.
Burying myself.
With a slightly shitty sound.
Burying myself.
And why is that?
Well, it's because of my distance from the microphone. Not only did that make the sound of my voice thinner,
Proximity effect?
but it caused this microphone to pick up a lot of the room in addition to my voice. And that natural reverb sound made my voice sound a little bit deeper in the mix. So I ended up with a really extreme and bizarre contrast of sounds, all due to where and how I performed relative to this mic. But I was really happy with the performance in this loud vocal, so I decided to live with it. I knew I would make it work. Somehow.
Maybe sooner than you expected.
Well, yeah, actually, because I needed more tracks to do more tracking, so my next step was to perform a bounce of those 2 totally different vocal takes down into one master vocal. The mixing for that bounce was quite a bit more difficult than for the guitar bounce because the sounds were so different. It was hard for me even to get a sense of how loud these vocals are compared to each other. And then there were little moments when the vocals overlapped, and well, with these crude controls, it was hard to make them work together.
It sounds like you're blaming the controls.
Yeah, I know, it's really my fault. I should have planned better. When I was recording the second vocal, I should have left silence in the places where I knew I would use the earlier soft vocal, and we wouldn't have that overlap problem.
But as it was?
I mean, it was my mistake. I just had to live with it. I mixed the 2 sounds together. I did my best, and I guess it sounds pretty good, but there's an obvious...
Mistake?
Yeah, there's an obvious mistake.
The concrete flow.
At least you're learning from it.
After that bounce, I had 1 track available and I decided to record bass. And for a moment, I was confounded by the constraints of this project. I have a bass, it's a Squire sitting over there, and it would certainly do the job, but did I want to add it to this project? It's one more instrument, which rubs against my goal of using as little gear as possible. And even a cheap Squire bass can be $300, as this one was, and that would have like significantly increased my budget. So before picking up that instrument, I looked around the shed to see if there was a cheaper workaround that I could use to simulate bass. And my eyes drifted over to that shelf and to this pedal. It has a classic like Green Ringer style octave effect, but its main job is to create a sub-octave, an octave below the signal that you put into it. The octave is messy and it's really only monophonic and it doesn't track very well. When I use it, it ends up creating something that's more like a synth sound than a fake bass sound. But it does create bass information, especially if you turn the mix knob counterclockwise, so I thought I would try it. And the results were wild. This pedal made this guitar sound like this crazy, throbbing synth bass. And it sounded even more like an aggressive synth when I added some distortion. I was practically giddy at having found this sound.
Oh, fuck, this sounds incredible. Holy shit, wait.
Even on playback, when I realized that it wasn't going to be a good stand-in for bass.
Oh, and why is that?
Well, the part that I chose and performed didn't really play the role that I wanted the bass to perform. It wasn't reinforcing the beat of the song in the right way. It wasn't percussive enough. But I loved it, and I thought that it could still work. Instead of being a bass, I thought it could be this crazy synth guitar thing. The kind of thing that I might double track and then hard pan to be the sonic foundation of the whole song. And that's exactly what I did. And to make room for that second track of the wobbly sub-octave guitar, I had to just delete the clean guitar that I had already recorded, which was honestly fine with me. I wasn't really that happy with the part.
So why did you record it?
I mean, I needed something to help be a skeleton of the song.
Sounds like an excuse for poor planning.
Yes, I suppose it is. After recording the second sub-octave guitar, I hard panned them and then bounced just those sounds at roughly equal levels onto the second stereo channel of the DP-006 and set about trying to record a real bass sound.
Oh, now you're in trouble.
And why is that?
Because you already used your guitar and your bass making pedal. If you track another sound with those components, it's going to sound the same. It won't do the things that you want the bass to do.
Yeah, that's right. So I needed to find something else to help me fake the bass. Once again, I looked around the shed and my eyes fell.
What about this?
On this. I toggled through the half dozen or so bass sounds and found one that sounded pretty good.
On its own?
Oh, well, no, it sounded kind of shitty on its own, but when I put it through the Behringer and the distortion, it was magic.
But more synth magic.
Yeah, it was a very similar sound. It was more percussive and had more low-end attack, but it wasn't really that distinct from the wobbly guitars I'd already recorded. But it fit in well with the new aesthetic of this recording, and I didn't think I had any better options. So I adjusted settings primarily on the distortion to get the right amount of attack, and I tracked it. At which point, all 4 of my tracks were once again full, and I needed to perform a bounce. I bounced the drums and the wobbly sub-octave guitars and my new key bass sound down to 1 stereo track, leaving 2 tracks for further recording.
Yeah, and a whole mess that you'd have to deal with later.
Wow, well, you're kind of skipping ahead.
But isn't this where you made the mistake? This is where you should talk about it.
I did make a mistake, and it really had 2 components. It was partly a failure to plan because I recorded all of the bounced elements, including the hard-panned wobbly guitars, at a static level, not considering whether I might want the volume of that element to be louder to create excitement or fill space or whatever. And I also didn't consider really just how big those wobbly sub-octave guitars were. When you have a really big sound, especially a sound with a lot of distortion, it can interfere with the perceived volume of other tracks because it just takes up so much space in the frequency spectrum. That can both drown out other parts and make them difficult to mix, and it can also make them seem small by comparison because that particular sound is just so wide. But I didn't think about whether these wobbly guitars were going to dwarf everything else I recorded. If I had thought that, I probably would have mixed them louder and just let them be the centerpiece of the song. But I didn't.
And you reap what you sow.
Yeah, almost immediately. After my big bounce, I had 2 tracks available for recording, tracks 1 and 3. And I had a big bed of bassy information over here on track 4, so I thought I needed to record something that had more like mids and treble information, which led me, of course, to pick up a guitar. Unlike on some of the earlier tracks, I wanted this guitar to actually sound like a guitar, which meant that I needed an amp. I had other amp options, but I couldn't refuse this one because of its cost, and it also played into this new theme of using things that I had when I was a young player. I plugged the guitar into the OS2 and into the clean channel of this little amp and started writing parts.
Good, good. Now why is that important?
Well, I knew I needed something that satisfied a bunch of competing goals. I wanted it to be a good part, like to be interesting, but I didn't want it to trample on the vocal at all. And I wanted it to be distinguishable from the bed of wobbly sub-octave guitar that I had already recorded. Since the sub-octave was down here, and then because of the octave lower, I focused on notes that were up here on the top 2 strings. I basically stumbled on an ascending line that I really liked, and then built that into a larger part. I liked the part, but when I recorded it, it didn't sound right. I thought it was too bland, too indistinct compared to the wobbly sub-octave guitar. So I added yet another guitar pedal to the mix, just to add a little bit of wobbly to the sound. I thought it was perfect, so I tracked it. And then double tracked it. I made minor adjustments to everything, to pickup selection on the guitar, to the phaser settings, and to distortion and tone settings on the OS2.
And why is that?
Because when you double track identical parts with identical sounds, you risk making both of them less distinct and introducing phasing and other complications, even if you've got them like hard panned. I thought these minor adjustments would help create more separation between the tracks.
And?
It worked okay, but honestly, if budget hadn't been dominating my decision-making, I probably would have picked a different guitar and a different amp and maybe even a different distortion to introduce even more difference and separation. But given what I had, I think I did a pretty good job. And then once again, all of my tracks were full, so I bounced my double track guitars down to the open stereo track and kept going.
But before you move on, after that bounce, how did you feel?
I felt pretty good. I felt like I was making progress. I honestly felt like I was getting close to wrapping the song.
Any fears or misgivings?
Well, my main concern was with the lead vocal. I mean, remember I said that the loud, shouty vocal sounded kind of thin compared to the quiet, whispered vocal. As I added more layers, the thinness of that part kind of became more pronounced. And I wanted to reinforce it, so I decided to record some background vocals. At first, I tried double tracking that vocal, and it just sounded like shit. Many people have great luck with double tracking vocals. I have never had good luck. It almost never works for me. If you have advice about how to make better double track vocals, please leave it in the comments. So I started trying other background vocal things.
Oh, burying myself.
And ended up with a vocal phrase that I could sort of sing in response to the call of the main vocal on the chorus. The problem was, every way that I recorded it, it seemed too big compared to that original thin vocal. So I ended up putting this in the empty space on that shelf.
This is a weird spot to put a mic.
And pointing my face and this microphone toward that back corner. That took some of the edge off the vocal and made it feel more like a background vocal.
I'm on the couch, burying myself.
And why is that?
God, I don't know.
Don't be lazy, think.
Because the extra reverb gives it depth and pushes it back in the mix. And because the indirect miking changes the EQ character of the voice that's actually recorded so that it's more distinct from the original vocal. I once again needed more tracks, so I bounced the response vocal in with the main vocal, and then went back to recording background vocals because I still hadn't strengthened the main vocal. I tried a few different things and ended up going with what I think of as a Chris Cornell vocal. And not the kind of vocal you're thinking, I can't sing like that, but there are a lot of songs where Cornell would sing the same vocal line just an octave lower. I tried that and it sounded okay, but still just too thick. It dominated that original thin vocal. So I began singing softer and softer. And then for fun, I sang it through this empty coffee can that I have sitting around the shed.
You spread out in my double bed.
Honestly, I've been holding on to this, hoping that I could use it in some kind of recording experiment, but I'd never gotten around to it. But when I sang the vocal through this coffee can, it sounded pretty good.
Sunday back to being friends.
So I kept it, and I was so excited about it that I ended up tracking another background vocal, this time more of like a straight double track of that earlier response style background vocal. Oh, burying myself. But honestly, in retrospect, I'm not really sure why I did that. I guess maybe I felt like I was on a roll tracking background vocals, but the response style vocal didn't need the extra support. I don't know, I can't remember. At this point, the tracks were full again, and I needed to do another bounce. And by this time, I had so much other vocal stuff happening that I knew I needed to just bounce all of the vocals somewhere. So I combined them with the guitars onto track 3, the stereo track.
Oh, why keep them on a separate track? Why not bounce them in with the bassy stuff?
Great question. In my experience, the bassy stuff is the hardest to get right in a mix. Or let me put it another way, it's the thing that I want to change the most as I hone the mix. So when I was using this more regularly, I got in the habit of maintaining 2 bounce tracks, separate bounce tracks on the stereo tracks, with all the bottom and percussive stuff on one track and everything else on the other. So I could adjust them to taste in the final mix.
Oh, look at you making a plan.
Yeah, you know, accidents happen. Now, honestly, I hoped that after tracking these background vocals, my job would be done, but as I played it back, it definitely was not done. This is where I finally had to look squarely at the problem of my wobbly sub-octave guitar part.
Oh yeah, here we go.
I mean, it's so good. I loved the sound, but it was so hard to record things around it. Everything seemed small next to it, unless I set individual elements at ridiculous volumes. And because it made the bottom end of the track so thick, it made the top end seem like ridiculously empty. I needed some way to add more sonic information that wouldn't have to compete directly with that bass content, but that could still fill a lot of space. And this is again where I struggled with my minimalism and budget goals. Peering around the shed, trying to think of something that I could use to create a lot of sound at not a lot of cost. Eventually, I decided to pick up the guitar again, but this time with only one other effect in the chain, and that was a reverb.
4 pedals on one project, man, you are insane!
I mean, I'm really not, because they all performed different and important roles. Especially this one. I mean, this really was a turning point for the track, which is kind of surprising because I don't really use a lot of reverb when I record. But I knew that reverb could fill space, so I searched for a really deep, wide ambient sound.
I kind of like that.
To use with a trebly guitar part. And together they were unlike anything I had ever recorded, but a pretty perfect solution to this particular recording problem. They created like a haze of ambiance that just floated above all the stuff happening in the lower register. I liked it enough that I double tracked it and then bounced it in with all of the non-bass stuff.
Saturday pretending.
And at that point, I really felt like the track was done. But I was wrong. As I listened to all the elements together, I found myself once again facing the repercussions of earlier decisions, of my failure to plan and to capture the right sound. Remember when I was recording the keyboard bass part, I talked about how similar it was to the wobbly sub-octave guitar? Because I had used the same effects? Well, as I added more layers to the track, the distinction between those two elements sort of vanished. I felt like I needed something percussive to reinforce the basic pulse of the song, you know, to do the thing the bass was supposed to do. And maybe because I had just added another guitar pedal, I didn't want to introduce any more new elements. So I picked up the guitar again, plugged it directly into the DP-006, and played some really simple, really clean, palm muted notes. Nothing fancy at all, really just mirroring what the key bass had done. And once I double tracked that,
Good Lord.
I felt like the final piece had fallen into place, and I performed a final mixdown. What? You don't have to be like that. That satisfaction and enthusiasm was short-lived. It evaporated as I slept, because when I woke up the next morning and listened to the mixdown, I wasn't happy. Not necessarily with the parts that I had recorded, but with the song as a whole. It sounded like what it was. A one-man band just recording extra instruments that play throughout the song. It didn't have any dynamics, it didn't have any drama, it just wasn't a good arrangement. And by the time you got to the third and final chorus, I mean, it was a drag. And that is not the way I want to be feeling when I get to my climactic chorus.
No, it's not.
I know.
What should you have done differently?
I should have thought differently about the parts that I was writing and recording. I should have thought more like a person who actually might perform those parts, or maybe like a person who might be listening to those parts, rather than a guy whose job is just to record a bunch of layers. Really, it's like a wall that I feel like I had been slowly backing into because I'd mishandled those original wobbly sub-octave guitars. They were big enough and distinct enough that they could have driven serious, interesting dynamics in the song. And I just failed to do that. And since everything else I recorded was basically a reaction to that sound, I felt like I was trapped.
And then you remembered.
And then I remembered that this is not a cassette portastudio. And I did something that I have never done before, play with some of the more modern DAW-like features in this device. In the main menu on this, there is an option for track edit, which allows you to manipulate one or more tracks in very specific ways. One of the available edits is called silence. The effect is very simple. You select a starting and ending point, and it will silence all sound between those 2 points. And you can apply silence to individual tracks or multiple tracks. Now, there are no options to like affect the angle of fading or anything. I mean, it just cuts off the sound in between those 2 points. But that kind of abrupt change can introduce valuable dynamics, and I used it to do just that. First, I used the silence feature on a few sections of my bassy bounce track.
When I hear your heels on the concrete floor.
Somewhat crude, but they really did the job and made me excited enough that I decided also to use the silence feature on my other bounce track, you know, that contains all the vocals and guitars, everything that isn't bassy. I silenced all the elements of that track in what had been the start of the third and final chorus. You know, the part that I said was super boring. I thought that one way out of that problem was to get rid of it and do something completely different. That was a little bit scary and actually kind of difficult to implement because of how simple and crude the silence effect is. But I finally got something I was happy with.
I should know better, but I don't.
Which left a giant space for me to fill, which led me back into the shed.
And before we go there,
Yes,
wouldn't it have been better?
yes, if I'd thought about these sort of dynamic shifts in advance. I know.
Have you learned your lesson?
God, I hope so. I don't know if I can handle you again.
Oh, you don't mean that.
So I bounced the thumpy, percussive, clean guitar that I had just recorded, leaving me with 2 available tracks, and I came into the shed to record lead guitar. Normally, I find it excruciating to write and record lead guitar parts. In this case, the writing part was a little bit easier because I wrote a very simple solo, and even the performing wasn't that bad, but the recording took a long time. It took a lot of work to dial in a sound that I liked.
Was there a problem?
I guess I had learned a lesson from all the earlier stages of the project because I was really particular about the sound that I was capturing. I wanted to take up a certain amount of space, have a certain amount of depth and body and brightness, and just took a lot of trial and error to get there. But eventually I did get there once again with this guitar and this distortion and this reverb, though with much more subtle settings, and once again with the Behringer octave divider. It just made the sound thicker in a way that really worked because I needed this solo to fill so much empty space. Now, because I had 2 tracks available, I ended up working on the sound and the parts like back and forth between those tracks so that every new track didn't have to delete the best prior track. And then at some point I ended up listening back to them at the same time in like a double-tracked twin guitar arrangement. And that sounded really cool, once again, because I had so much space to fill. So I decided 2-track, 2 very similar lead guitar sounds playing identical parts. They're featured, of course, on the guitar solo, but also in other sections of the song to support other melodies I had already recorded.
Wait, talk more about that.
Well, some of those earlier guitar parts still sounded thin compared to the wobbly, throbbing sub-octave guitar, and mirroring them with a little bit more distortion just made them sound thicker and more present. Honestly, I wish I could go back and use the sound I had captured for that lead guitar for all of the guitar parts, but not possible in this device.
And yet,
I'm left with something different, something that's kind of more murky and indistinct, and in a way I think fits the vibe of the song, even if the combination of these songs wasn't entirely planned or intentional. And then for a moment I thought that I was done, but I decided to record one more part to add a little bit of top-end sparkly something to highlight chord changes in different sections of the song. So I found a really bright plinky sound on this keyboard, put it through that bright floaty reverb,
Good Lord, are we done yet?
And yes, at that point we were done. I did a final mix down, which is honestly easy because I'd already been performing all of these pre-mixes, these bounces along the way. And then I sat back and marveled at my creation.
And?
At the process that led to it. I had forgotten just how hard it is to record with a device like this. And it's not because the device itself is hard to use. It's because a Spartan multitracker forces you to do everything else right. That can be frustrating, even exhausting. But in the end, it's also really rewarding. I enjoy recording partly because of the challenge, the opportunity to solve problems in what is already, by its nature, a creative endeavor. And then there's the ultimate reward of playing back a sound that you created, seeing it in the harshest possible light, and liking it. I mean, that gives you an amazing feeling. So I guess the end result is that I have a song that I'm very happy with. It's still called Pretty Mess, and it's going to be appended to the end of this video. But I also feel better about my skills as a recording person than I have in a long time. In a way, I feel like I learned as much from the 4 days of working on this song as I learned over the 6 months of working on songs in the Model 12. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the Model 12 and I am excited to return to it. But I am incredibly thankful for this little device. It's one that I will keep and return to often. Not only as a challenge, but because I like the work that I put into and get out of it. And before I wrap, I guess I should talk about how I did vis-a-vis my 2 goals, minimalism and budget. In a spreadsheet, I listed all of the gear that I used on this project and what it cost me to acquire. The total cost is a little more than $700, which is about the cost of the Model 12 on its own. It's a lot of money, but compared to what many people, including me, have spent on recording gear, I think it's fair to call it a budget option, especially when I compare it to the gear that I used on my first real home recording session. Now, the caveat is that I had acquired a lot of this gear over many years, but still, I'm surprised by how much I had invested in the gear that went into those songs. And that extra money did not make them sound better. They are stylistically very different from what I just recorded, but I feel like this recent recording is much better. And that's mostly a reflection of the skills and techniques and concepts that I have developed using this device and others like it. I don't really believe in perfect, but practice does make better. And I'm very glad to have spent a few days practicing the fundamentals of recording. If you made it this far, my God, you are a hero. Thank you so much for your time. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, big feelings, please leave them in the comments. Listen to Pretty Mess at the end of this video. Let me know what you think, and otherwise, take care of yourselves. I really appreciate you. I hope you're doing well. I'll see you next time.
It's 2 a.m. Get your text. Black tights and a vintage dress. I'm still awake, just like you guessed. Can't remember my address. Saturday pretending. Sunday back to being friends. Oh, burying myself. You know what you're getting. The last call is your safest bet. Oh, burying myself. You spread out in my double bed, and I'm on the couch burying myself. Sunday back to being friends. Oh, burying myself. You know what you're getting. Your last call is your safest bet. Oh, burying myself. You spread out in my double bed, and I'm on the couch burying myself. Burying myself. Burying myself. I see you brought a change of clothes. You say we'll meet up, but we won't. I should know better, but I don't. Spread out in my double bed, and I'm on the couch burying myself. You spread out in my double bed, and I'm on the couch burying myself. You spread out in my double bed, and I'm on the couch burying myself. You spread out in my double bed, and I'm on the couch burying myself, burying myself, burying myself, burying myself.
Thank you.
You know where to find me.
Thank you, old friend.